Donald Trump's actions today went far beyond a standard political disagreement or a heated debate over trade. He issued a formal, high-stakes ultimatum to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney that effectively changes the DNA of North American relations. This was not a casual comment made in passing, a social media outburst, or a mistake made during a press conference. It was a calculated, direct demand for submission. When the President of the United States draws a hard line against Canada, the very nation that shares the longest undefended border in human history, it signals the end of an era. We are no longer observing a simple policy dispute. We are witnessing the first act of a massive global crisis. This is a moment that will be studied by historians for the next 100 years, because it represents a total break from the way the modern world functions. While the general public might see this as just another headline, the reality is that the foundation of Western security just shifted beneath our feet. What we are seeing is the terrifying reality of a superpower turning its back on its most loyal friend. For over 200 years, the relationship between the United States and Canada was governed by a specific set of unwritten rules based on mutual respect and shared interests. In a single afternoon, Donald Trump shredded those rules. The world is fundamentally different than it was when you woke up this morning. We have entered a period that is colder, more dangerous, and more volatile than anything this continent has experienced since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Back then, the threat came from a foreign enemy pointing nuclear warheads at the Florida coast. Today, the instability is coming from within the heart of the alliance itself. To truly understand why this is so heavy, you have to look at how deep the connection between these two countries goes. It isn't just about two governments being friendly. It is about two nations that have functioned almost as a single unit for generations. The bond between the United States and Canada is the most deeply integrated partnership in the history of the world. They don't just trade with each other, they operate one shared economy, one unified defense perimeter, and even a shared electrical grid. In many places, the water systems and emergency services are completely intertwined. The 525-mile border was never just a line on a map. It was a global symbol of peace. It was a place where two separate nations decided they didn't need to point guns at each other to feel safe. This undefended border was a philosophy that proved two free democracies could live side by side without one trying to dominate the other. It was a declaration to the rest of the planet that cooperation is more powerful than conquest. Today, Donald Trump publicly torched that philosophy. He didn't do it by accident or through a misunderstanding. He did it with a smile, signaling that the era of partnership is over and the era of American dominance over its neighbors has begun. This ultimatum to Mark Carney is a line in the sand that removes the concept of Canadian sovereignty from the American equation. By demanding that a sovereign leader obey American dictates or face dire consequences, Trump has effectively told the world that Canada is no longer a partner but a subject. This completely ignores 2 centuries of shared history where Canada has stood beside the United States in every major war, every economic depression, and every global crisis. The weight of this moment is found in the fact that the invisible contract between these two peoples, a contract written in blood and shared sacrifice, has been cancelled without warning. If you have ever wondered what it looks like when the most stable region on Earth suddenly becomes a flashpoint for conflict, you are watching it happen in real time. This is the moment the trust died, and once that trust is gone, the entire structure of North American life begins to crumble. The gravity of this situation cannot be overstated because it affects everything from the food on your table to the security of your home. Most people don't realize that the US and Canada are so close that a threat to one is a threat to the stability of the other. By turning a friend into an adversary, Trump has invited a level of unpredictability into our daily lives that we haven't seen in lifetimes. We are watching the rules of the continent being rewritten by force rather than by agreement. This is a historic pivot point where the rules-based order that kept the peace for decades is being replaced by a might-makes-right approach. This isn't just a bad day for diplomacy. It is a total transformation of how power is used in the Western Hemisphere. The consequences of this ultimatum will ripple out into the economy, the military, and the very idea of what it means to be an American ally. For nearly a century, the relationship between the United States and Canada was built on a bedrock assumption that stood firm through world wars, economic depressions, and Cold Wars. This assumption was that both nations were sovereign partners. While they frequently disagreed on trade, arguing for years over things like softwood lumber, dairy quotas, and auto parts, those disputes were always handled as a negotiation between equals. At the end of every argument, both sides walked away with their independence and dignity intact. This was the invisible contract that kept the continent stable. Today, Donald Trump did not just challenge that contract, he declared it dead. He looked at Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, and used a single word that has sent shockwaves through the global community: obey. This is a word that is never used between allies. By choosing to say obey, instead of negotiate or cooperate, Trump has signaled that Canada is no longer being treated as a sovereign friend, but as a subordinate. In his public remarks, this demand for obedience was not presented in isolation. It was backed by the explicit shadow of American military and economic force. Trump made it clear that if Canada does not fall in line with his specific demands, the United States is prepared to use its overwhelming power to compel them. This is a total departure from the rules-based order that has governed North America for 200 years. We are witnessing a shift from a doctrine of partnership to a doctrine of dominance, where the threat of force is now a standard tool of American diplomacy toward its closest neighbor. To truly understand why this is happening now, you have to look at the transformation of the man in the Oval Office. When Donald Trump returned to power in January 2025, he did not come back as the man he was in 2017. His second term is defined not by a search for political redemption, but by an absolute drive for total dominance. In his first term, there were guardrails, advisors who pushed back, established norms that resisted his impulses, and institutions that functioned as a check on his power. Today, those guardrails are gone. He has surrounded himself with a cabinet of absolute loyalists who share his worldview, and he views his 2024 landslide victory as a personal mandate from the American people to do whatever he deems necessary without apology. Trump's core belief is that the international system created after World War II was a mistake designed by weak leaders who allowed the rest of the world to rip off the United States. He believes that every alliance, including the one with Canada, has been a one-way street where America gives and others take. In his mind, the only language that the world, and specifically Canada, actually respects is strength. He has looked at Canada, a nation long known for being a polite, peaceful middle power, and decided it is the perfect proof of concept to show the rest of the planet that America is now the boss. By forcing Canada to bend to his will, he is sending a message to every other ally: if we can make Canada obey, we can make anyone obey. This escalation is not just about trade, it is about the very identity of the United States on the world stage. Trump has frequently brought up the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state, a concept that began as provocative rhetoric but has now evolved into a serious geopolitical threat. By questioning Canada's independent statehood and suggesting its future is conditional on its compliance with American goals, he is effectively dismantling the concept of a sovereign Canada. For Canadians, who recently elected Mark Carney specifically to defend their sovereignty against this type of pressure, this is an existential threat. For Americans, it is a sign that the American century is being replaced by an era where power is exercised through ultimatum rather than alliance. The confrontation between Donald Trump and Mark Carney is more than a policy dispute. It is a collision between two completely different ways of seeing the world. On one side, you have Prime Minister Mark Carney, who is the literal polar opposite of Donald Trump. Carney is a world-class technocrat, a man who built his reputation on being surgically rational and unshakably calm. He is a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, meaning he has spent his life navigating the highest levels of global finance and managing historic crises, from the 2008 financial collapse to the turbulence of Brexit. He does not lead with emotion or rhetoric. He leads with data, precision, and a measured approach that is designed to provide stability. Carney rose to lead the Liberal Party in early 2025, following the political collapse of Justin Trudeau, and he won the federal election on a very specific promise: to defend Canadian sovereignty against the unpredictability of a second Trump term. Canadians did not elect Mark Carney in spite of his willingness to stand up to the United States. They elected him precisely because of it. His mandate is a direct reflection of a nation that wants a leader who can outthink and outweight a volcanic opponent. This creates a dangerous deadlock because you now have an American president who demands total obedience and a Canadian prime minister whose entire political survival depends on refusing to give it. The escalation that led to today's crisis did not happen overnight. It was built piece by piece through a series of increasingly aggressive moves by the Trump administration. Since returning to the White House, Trump has slapped existential tariffs on Canada's most vital industries: steel, aluminum, lumber, and auto parts at levels meant to cripple the Canadian economy and force a surrender. But even more shocking than the economic warfare is the change in Trump's language. He began floating the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state, a comment that many initially dismissed as a joke or a distraction. However, over the last few months, that rhetoric shifted from a punchline to a policy goal. Trump has publicly referred to Carney as the future governor of Canada and has suggested that the US-Canada border is merely an artificially drawn line that could be redrawn through force and persuasion. Today, the situation reached a breaking point. In public remarks that have stunned the international community, Trump moved beyond economic threats and directly referenced American military power in the same breath as Canada's future. He made it clear that if Canada continues to resist his trade and annexation demands, the United States has options beyond tariffs. Reports characterizing the private discussions between the two leaders confirm that Trump explicitly told Carney that Canada must obey the United States. This is the first time in modern history that an American president has used the language of an occupying force toward its closest ally. By bringing the shadow of military force to the negotiating table, Trump has turned a trade disagreement into a fundamental threat to Canada's existence as a sovereign nation. The contrast between these two leaders defines the current danger. While Carney is attempting to use the tools of international law, trade agreements and diplomacy to protect his country, Trump is operating on the principle that might makes right. Trump views the polite, cooperative nature of Canadian politics as a weakness to be exploited. He believes that if he applies enough pressure, both through the wallet and through the threat of the sword, Canada will eventually break. Carney, however, has signaled that he is prepared for a long and painful standoff, stating that Canada will not be bullied and will not be without options. We are now watching to see what happens when an immovable object of rational resistance meets an unstoppable force of volcanic dominance. Mark Carney's response to Donald Trump was immediate, steel-nerved and calculated for maximum impact. He didn't just push back, he drew a line in the sand by stating clearly that Canada is not for sale and will not be bullied. This was more than a defense of national pride. It was a rejection of the idea that Canada is an American subordinate. Most importantly, Carney sent a chilling signal to Washington when he noted that Canada has friends all over the world and will not be without options. For a man who usually speaks in the precise, careful language of a central banker, these words carry massive weight. He is telling the world that if the United States decides to dismantle its alliances and treat its partners like subjects, Canada is ready to look elsewhere. This is a direct message to Beijing, Brussels, and New Delhi that Canada is open to a new world order, one where it no longer relies exclusively on its southern neighbor. This isn't just a high-level political argument, it is a direct threat to your wallet and your way of life. Most people don't realize that Canada is the single largest export market for the United States. It is bigger than China and the entire European Union combined. We are talking about over $700 billion in trade, and 2 million American jobs that are directly at risk. The US and Canadian economies are so tightly woven together that they function like a single machine. Our energy systems, for example, are a single integrated system with an international border running through the middle. Canada provides the vast majority of US crude oil imports, powering American cars and heating American homes. If the trust between these two nations breaks, and Canada begins rerouting that energy to Europe or Asia, the consequences for ordinary Americans will be immediate and painful. If this ego clash continues, the cost will show up at every gas pump and every grocery store across America. Because the supply chains are so integrated, any disruption at the border acts like a massive tax on everyday items. The people who will truly pay for this confrontation are not the politicians in Washington or Ottawa, they are the auto workers in Detroit, Michigan and Windsor, Ontario, who rely on parts that cross the border multiple times before a car is even finished. They are the farmers in the Midwest who have spent a century building businesses based on the assumption of frictionless trade. When that friction returns, prices spike. We are already seeing global oil prices jump and fertilizer costs skyrocket due to international instability. Adding a trade war with our largest partner is like throwing gasoline on a fire. The ripple effect Carney mentioned is already beginning to take shape. For the first time in modern history, Canada is actively looking to diversify its trade away from the United States. In early 2026, Carney made waves by cutting tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for better access for Canadian agriculture, a move that infuriated the Trump administration. This shows that Canada is no longer waiting for American permission to act in its own interest. If the United States continues to demand obedience, Canada will continue to seek out new partners who treat them as equals. This shift could permanently weaken the American economy as the US loses its most reliable source of energy and its most stable trading partner. Ultimately, the stakes of this defiance are global. If Canada, a nation that has stood beside the United States in every major conflict for 2 centuries, decides it can no longer trust its closest ally, why should any other country? Carney's stance is a warning that the American century is at a crossroads. By forcing its best friend to look for options in places like China and Europe, the US is effectively pushing its closest partners away. This isn't a game of chicken where one side can simply win. It is a fracture in a 200-year-old foundation. If it isn't repaired, the resulting economic and political damage will be felt by every single family on both sides of that 525-mile border. There is a deeper, darker truth beneath the headlines. This isn't just about trade deals or border security. Canada is being used as the global test case for a new era of American power. If Donald Trump can successfully force a wealthy, stable, democratic, and English-speaking ally like Canada to obey through sheer intimidation and threats of force, it sends a clear message that no nation on earth is truly safe or sovereign. For decades, the world operated under a doctrine of partnership, where countries worked together as allies. Today, we are seeing that replaced by a doctrine of dominance. If this strategy works, the world of international law and collective security, the system that has kept the peace since 1945, will be gone. In its place, we will see a return to what history calls an empire, where a single superpower dictates the terms of existence for everyone else, and alliance is just another word for subservience. The irony here is absolutely staggering and should not be ignored. The United States was literally founded on the rejection of an empire. The entire American story began with a people who refused to be dominated by a distant power that dictated their trade, ignored their laws, and demanded they obey without question. Now, in the 21st century, an American president is taking that exact same imperial posture toward his northern neighbor by suggesting that Canada's status as an independent nation is optional, and even musing about absorbing it as the 51st state. Trump is turning the original American philosophy on its head. He is treating the border not as a sacred line between two free peoples, but as an inconvenience that can be erased if the smaller neighbor doesn't follow orders. Mark Carney understands that he isn't just fighting for a better price on lumber or auto parts. He is fighting for the fundamental principle that nations, regardless of their size, have the right to choose their own path. He is defending the idea that being an ally means being a partner, not a subject. This is why his resistance is so critical. As he refuses to bend, the entire world is watching. China, Europe, India, and every middle power on the planet are observing this confrontation to see if the United States is still the leader of the free world, or if it has become something else entirely. They are watching to see if America first means America only, and if the rules that have governed the world for 80 years still apply to the person who wrote them. This test case has life-altering implications for everyone. If the US successfully breaks Canada's will, it sets a precedent that agreements like NATO or the USMCA are only valid as long as they serve the immediate whims of the White House. It tells every country that their sovereignty is conditional on their obedience. This creates a world where nations will stop looking to the US for leadership and instead begin building their own parallel universes of trade and military defense to protect themselves from American pressure. Carney's elbows-up approach is a signal that Canada would rather risk economic pain and find new friends in Beijing or Brussels than accept a future as a vassal state. We are at a crossroads where the very definition of a free nation is being challenged, and the outcome of this struggle will determine the global order for the next century. As this crisis unfolds, the path forward leads to 3 distinct and uncomfortable scenarios. The first is maximum pressure, success, which essentially means Canada breaks under the weight of American demands. In this scenario, Prime Minister Mark Carney looks at a Canadian economy buckling under 50% steel and aluminum tariffs and a stalled automotive sector. Fearing a total collapse of the Canadian dollar and mass unemployment, he returns to the negotiating table and gives Donald Trump the win he is looking for. This would likely involve Canada accepting one-sided trade terms and potentially making massive concessions on Arctic sovereignty or defense spending. While trade would resume, the 200-year relationship would be permanently scarred. Canada would no longer be a trusted partner. It would be a vassal state that complied only because it was forced to, and the spirit of North American cooperation would be dead forever. The second, and increasingly more likely scenario, is a prolonged and bitter standoff. In this case, neither man blinks. Mark Carney sticks to his electoral mandate to protect Canadian sovereignty, and Donald Trump refuses to back down from his demand for obedience. Canada would move beyond words and begin a campaign of targeted retaliation. This means slapping massive tariffs on American goods specifically produced in states that voted for Trump, hitting Florida's orange juice, Kentucky's bourbon, and the Midwest's agricultural heartland. Behind the scenes, Canada would begin a strategic divorce, decisively building a new economic future that excludes the United States. We are already seeing the early signs of this as Carney courts new trade deals with China and the European Union. This scenario leads to a North American fracture, where the integrated supply chains that have kept prices low for decades are torn apart, leading to long-term inflation and economic decline on both sides of the border. The third and absolute worst-case scenario is that the rhetoric about military force becomes a reality. This is no longer a fringe theory, it is a possibility being discussed in the halls of power. Donald Trump is surrounded by advisors who believe American power should be used without apology to secure continental interests. If the US moves from economic pressure to quasi-military actions such as blockading Canadian ports or moving troops to secure energy resources, the world as we know it ends. A US move against a NATO ally like Canada would instantly destroy the Western alliance. No country in Europe or Asia would ever trust an American security guarantee again. This would lead to a global run on the US dollar, as it loses its status as the world's reserve currency. American power relies on the consent and cooperation of allies. If that is replaced by fear and force, the American century is over. These scenarios show that we are at a point of no return. Whether it is a quiet surrender, a long trade war, or a military disaster, the old version of the US-Canada relationship is gone. Each path leads to a future where the longest undefended border is no longer a symbol of peace, but a line of tension. The decisions made in the next 30 days will determine whether North America remains the most prosperous region on Earth, or if it becomes a site of historic instability. Both leaders are currently betting that the other will break first, but the real risk is that the system itself breaks before either man gives in. This moment did not come from nowhere. It was built piece by piece over years of eroding norms and the dangerous habit of people claiming he doesn't really mean it. For nearly a decade, we watched as the boundaries of acceptable behavior were pushed further and further, while many chose to normalize the abnormal by calling it negotiation strategy or bluster. Now the bill for that complacency has come due. The longest undefended border in the world, a 525-mile testament to human cooperation, is officially under a shadow. While we do not yet see soldiers massing at the border crossings, the good faith that served as the invisible glue for this continent has cracked. In engineering, a cracked foundation does not heal on its own. It either receives immediate intentional repair, or it eventually fractures completely under the next application of pressure. Donald Trump has made it clear that he is not done applying pressure. His entire political and psychological logic is built on escalation, pushing until the other side breaks, and if they don't break, pushing even harder. The question for every Canadian and American watching this unfold is simple but terrifying. At what point does pressure become rupture? History rarely sends a formal warning before a catastrophe. Instead, it arrives in moments exactly like this one, a threat issued, a sovereign line crossed, and a word like obey spoken that cannot be taken back. Once you tell a friend they are now a subject, the relationship is fundamentally altered, regardless of whether a single shot is fired.